Pretty often whenever I play Octobrush, I actually get questions in regards to my builds, specifically like my vanilla Octobrush build, which has for a long time been something really outside of the norm and what most people would really consider unoptimal, which doesn't matter because the weapon is great and doesn't need gear, but that's a different thing altogether. So I figured today I would actually spend to actually go through and explain some of my builds, the ideas behind them, why I use certain things, and just general ideas that I have and had, and why my builds are the way they are, just to sort of get an idea of why I use these sort of things, and maybe help those that might not know what to build or what to use can get an idea off of what I'm using. And with that, we will start with just the vanilla Octobrush. Now, historically, my build for this has been sort of all over the place, but now it has been pretty set in stone ever since the Autobomb's cost had been adjusted, and I made a whole video talking about that if you're interested, where I also cover the same sort of build, but I actually use a double Autobomb build, and have been since that change. Now, I've always felt that people misunderstood Autobomb in general, and that's even a video I've been considering making, but the double Autobomb and at a glance might sound really bad. I mean, something like double Splat Bomb and double Suction Bomb, those are good. People can see why you would do that. But double Autobomb, why would you want double of something that isn't even lethal? Well, there's a good reason, and that's because Autobomb, I've never seen it as a bomb. I've always seen it as a utility sub. It's not lethal. It can be, but it's not lethal. So the way I've always approached it is more of a utility sub. And you might see that in some of my older videos where I've talked about it using it as scouting. And that's pretty much what I do. Scouting, and then in my most recent video where I was doing some commentary over some of my gameplay, I mentioned using autobombs as a way to distract stuff like splatlangs and chargers. Things like that are why I run double autobomb. Now, it might sound really stupid to build around just something as minute as that, but it actually comes in pretty handy quite often for me to displace some of the things that struggle or that I struggle against personally. Weapons that just sort of exist to shut down long range, well, if you have to keep them moving, then they're not going to be paying attention to you. And that's sort of the whole idea behind the double autobomb, is simply to keep the people that are going to be on me off me. The other thing I get questions about is my use of drop roller, and I'm just going to go ahead and preface immediately that this is the only one that I end up using drop roller on, and there's a really good reason for that: the inkjet. Now, it can be useful for suitor dunks as well, but I've actually had it come up more often for inkjets than anything else. Drop roller, I feel like, has kind of been slept on for a while. Now, it's a bit more common now than it used to be back when I was using it, and I had started using it. After a couple of changes, buffs make it more useful, of course. But the big reason why I use drop roller is because the Octobrush, depending on how you play it, it might not be always played far back. It might not be in a position where your inkjet marker is hiding and away from the fight. You might just be returning to a spot where someone could be camping you, depending on how you play. And so the drop roller I always see more as a safety net and a way to ensure that no matter where I am, the sort of situation I'm in with my inkjet, that there's a good chance that I'll survive it. And while that might sound like it doesn't happen very often, I actually have clips of it happening pretty often. So it does work out for me. This is still something that suffers a little bit from the game's latency, but let's be real, what doesn't suffer from this game's latency anymore? Basically, the easiest way I can explain my vanilla Octobrush set is it is simply a build that I use to enable the weapon and my playstyle. It makes my special usage safer, it makes it to where I can contest things that usually shut me down a lot easier, and distract things like that. It's just a general basic build that I use to enable my sort of play. Now let's move right along to the Octobrush Nouveau. I will say that going into these next two, I'm not really going to say nearly as much because there really isn't any sort of minute thing to these two as there was with the vanilla. But with the Octobrush Nouveau, I sort of lean very heavily into the fact that the weapon is sort of designed a certain way with its sub and special. This is a version of the Octobrush that can't really exist on its own, so I only ever really play this in like squads or scrims or something where I can actually communicate, and so I lean very heavily into that way of playing. So I have a ton of Subsaver. This is something that you might not see very common anymore or at all on anything that uses beacons, but this again is me leaning very heavily into that supportive role that this sort of inherently has. And this amount of Subsaver wall might be slightly overkill. I could probably reduce it a sub or two and still be fine. This is just a good way to ensure that my team is always available to get right back into the fight to assist me or assist someone else if things start to go south. And then when it comes to the special power, it is simply just to make getting 4 targets on the 10 missiles a lot easier. And then like I mentioned before, drop roller doesn't exist on this or the other, the Kensa Octobrush. And the simple reason is that the biggest draw for using the drop roller is purely the inkjet. Inkjet gets punished so easily, so that using drop roller basically means that you will likely not get punished for using it, while nothing else has that sort of ability here, so you're not really going to get punished as much. And the only other thing that you'd be doing is just super jumping, and while you could drop roll for the super jump, it's just not as good for just general super jumps as just stealth the jump itself is. So I would consider my Octobrush Nouveau a build more of like leaning into a supportive role, very much playing that position, and then still having abilities that make my weapon itself function, which granted only really consist of swim speed, but it is still an enabler for the weapon itself. And then finally the Kensa Octobrush. Now looking at this build, you might see that it's sort of a little bit all over the place, and it might look to some people like what a build in Splatoon 1 would have looked like. The reason why I incorporate quick respawn into this build is actually because when I play the Kensa Octobrush, this is the one that I usually play a bit more aggressive than I normally do. And it's because its kit is more offensively focused with the suction bomb and the hammer, that this is more of a one where when I play it, I tend to play a bit more forward with like my shooters, like my NZAP or my Splatter Shot or my CDS, things like that. I play a bit more forward with this weapon than I would with the other two. So to sort of mitigate any sort of mistakes that will come from that and any sort of like being caught out or basically anything that happens, there's a chance that the amount of punishment I get for it is reduced. And that also comes into play with the Special Saver. Now, I've debated replacing the Special Saver with something else because, yeah, Special Saver isn't really that good, and Hammer is so meh, and the Octobrush does a great job building special. So this is still something that I am currently still working on, but the basis of this build is probably still likely to have QR in it, simply because it affords me more opportunity to play the sort of play style that I am playing with this. A more aggressive, more just forward, taking fights, that sort of play style is what I use this one for, and that's pretty much what this build affords me. Now, over time, these 3 builds have changed a bit. Most of the changes came with the vanilla Octobrush. Prior to the Autobomb changes I had mentioned before, I actually used a lot of ink recovery instead of Subsaver, and my build was mostly a mix of drop roller, ink recovery, and swim speed. And that was getting a lot of people asking me, what the hell is your build about? And it was still sort of the same thing. It was built around having Autobombs out to distract, and the ink recovery was helping with that. And then it changed when the Autobombs cost got reduced. And then as for like the Nouveau and the Kensa, those builds haven't really changed too much. When the Nouveau came out, I didn't really build around having beacons, and then, you know, when it started to show that it really isn't something you could play solo with effectively, and it was just more so better for communication and team play, that I just decided to lean very much into that. And then, like what I mentioned before, the Kensa Octobrush is still a very much work in progress. So I want to know what people think of these builds. Granted, you know, these are things that I've been working on for years, especially with the vanilla Octobrush. And for those of you that are watching this that play Octobrush, I'd be interested in what you think of this build and what some of your builds are. I'd definitely be interested in seeing it, so feel free to leave them below. This is something that this weapon isn't gear dependent, which I think has always been sort of a perk that it has and has had since the first game. It's not dependent on anything, so these weird wacky builds that you see here, and like I mentioned before, with just having a bunch of ink recovery, those sorts of builds can exist because this weapon doesn't really need anything. Where you have some, like now with main power-up existing, some weapons need main power-up, where the Octobrush has sort of never needed that. It's the same with the ink brush. The brush weapons just don't really need anything and can have these sort of fun builds. So I've always been interested in seeing the sort of stuff that people come up with and these sort of ideas and playstyles that people use these weapons for. So I would love to see what everyone else is using. So I want to thank you all for watching, and if you'd be interested in more stuff like this, feel free to leave a comment. I might do a video where I talk about my ink brush builds, which are a little bit different as well. But yeah, that'll be it, and I will see you all next time.